Alrighty, well, I'm going to tell you guys one of the stories about a situation that occurred with me a few years back. It's actually one of the final straws. It's one of the reasons that I left Perth, because I just decided I was never going to have any peace as long as I was there. And what had happened was, where I lived above the Royal Bank in Perth, downtown, we had no parking for tenants. And so that meant that I had to pay the town $50 a month for a permit to park in a municipal parking lot overnight. Now, when I got my permit, they told me where to park. It wasn't like I had any real say over it. They told me what lot I had to park in and all the rest of it, and where in the lot to park and so on. And so, anyway, the lot was about a block away from my apartment. The lot was next door to a house that had been cut up into apartments. It was actually between two houses, is what it was, that had been cut up into. Well, one house that had been cut up into apartments, and one house that an elderly woman lived in. And the parking lot was in between the two. Anyway, I'd parked down there. Now, this was close to the public library, and the house that had been cut up into apartments was directly across from the public library, and the public library had public Wi-Fi, so you could get onto their Wi-Fi signal if you were anywhere around there, and you could use their Wi-Fi. Now, I had just gotten a cell phone. I was one of the last holdouts, I think, to get on the internet, and I didn't have any Wi-Fi service in my apartment. I wasn't paying or subscribing to any service. I was just using the library's Wi-Fi. But in order to do that, I had to sit in my car near to the library. And so I would go down there and I'd watch YouTube videos, and I'd check my Facebook account and check my email and all that business. Anyway, sometimes I would sit in the car for a couple hours or more, sometimes several hours, just on the internet surfing the web. Now, I wasn't paying any attention to what was going on in the neighboring houses or anything. I didn't care about that. Whatever was going on in those places was none of my business. But what started happening is the police started coming and parking near to where I was, and the cop would sit in the car and watch me. I did notice that, but then I was used to being harassed by the police and being watched by them and all that. So that was a common thing for me, so I didn't really think too much of it, because it was just normal. In my life, that was just normal. And so, anyway, the OPP would come and sit there and watch, and I just didn't think anything of it. But anyway, one day after a real brutal snowstorm, I was cleaning the ice and snow off my car, and this woman comes out of the house. Now, I didn't recognize her at first. I realized later on I did know her, but I had known her years ago when she was a little girl, and I was a young man and she was a little girl. I was kind of a half-ass friend of her sister, and I knew her family a bit. Her family owned a store downtown that sold records. I remember back when we used to be able to buy records, 45s and LPs and all that. Anyway, they owned the store downtown. It was called Dr. Music. Her father owned that. Anyway, the sister that I was friends with was close to my age, but this particular woman that came out of the house, she had just been a little girl back then. She might have been about 10, I guess. When I was like 18, she'd have been about 10, I guess, something like that. So I knew her to see her. I knew who she was, but that was all I knew about her. I remember one time I was in the store, and I was standing there talking to the lady at the checkout stand, and I bought some 45 RPM records. I used to buy those back when they were like 99 cents a piece or whatever, and I'd buy them. And anyway, I went in there and I'd bought a few 45 RPM records of songs that I liked. This would have been back around 1986, so it was like, Shake You Down by Gregory Abbott, that sort of thing. You know, um, I forget now, but songs like that anyway. I bought a few of them. Anyway, here I was anyway, standing there talking to the lady at the cash who I knew. I knew her too. It's a small town, you kind of knew everybody, one of those places. And this girl, the one who confronted me years later, she came into the store, and the way she walks all the time, she has a ponytail, and she walks really fast as if she's being chased by somebody. And the ponytail does this. I mean, if you were walking past her with that swinging ponytail, it could hit you in the side of the head and knock you out, really, But she came flying past me, and she came in, and I just nodded and said hello. I knew who she was, because she was the sister of this other girl who I was a friend of, and I knew her parents owned the store and so on like that. And so I just nodded and said hello, and she came in, and she spun her head around and she says, "Go fuck yourself," and went straight to the back of the store. Anyway, the lady who was running the cash register, the lady I knew that was running the check stand, she just shook her head and she said, "Yeah, she's got mental problems," Anyway, that'd be back, like I say, in 1986. Fast forward to 2015. I have this woman now coming out of the house. I didn't know it was the same person. I didn't recognize her at first. I found out later who she was, and that's who it was anyway. But the music store is long gone now. It went out of business in the 1990s. And in fact, that woman's father was killed in a bad drunk driving accident. He got partying with a guy that installed a garage door at their house. The guy had come from Ottawa, a guy that ran a business installing garage doors. And this particular guy, he was a real partier. Their father was a real party. He was a party animal, you could say. He could make friends with anybody, this guy. He was just very super friendly and stuff. He was a real extrovert. And I guess after the garage door was installed, he and the garage doorman started drinking together, and they got pretty well wasted, and then they decided they were going to go to Ottawa in the window and door truck. And so they continue to party, Anyway, they went off the road, and I guess the truck rolled over, and the two of them were killed anyway. And it was kind of a tragedy, really. I actually always liked the father there. He was, like I say, he was immature, for sure. He was like a big kid, but you couldn't help but to like the guy, He was just very, very good-natured kind of a person, and, you couldn't help but to like the man, really. He just had that way about him. Anyway, going on with the story here, this woman, she comes out of the house. I guess she was one of the tenants in one of the apartments that had this house, that had been cut up into apartments. Anyway, she come out and she comes storming over to where I was. And she's confronting me. She's telling me that, you better stop sitting here in your car, and you're nothing but an effing pervert, and everybody knows what you are. And the old lady in the house over there, she thinks that you're sitting there stalking her and that you're going to rape her. And the OPP, they think that you're stalking that old woman and you're going to rape her, and they think you're dealing drugs out of your car. And she just went on. And my boyfriend's an OPP officer, and if you don't stop sitting here in your car, I'm going to have him beat you up and take you to jail. This is what, And I just kind of looked at her and I said, oh, well, whatever. Like, good on you for that. Whatever. And the woman was unstable, I could tell. And anyway, she went away. And after that, every time I saw her on the street, she'd go crazy. If she passed me on the sidewalk or whatever, you do yourself a favor and get the fuck out of town. Like that, My boyfriend's going to get you. And all this. Well, it turns out this one cop started following me around and harassing me, this one OPP. And I found out this was the supposed boyfriend. Now, it turns out this cop was married, and what was happening is the woman was turning tricks in the apartment, and she was sexually servicing several members of our local OPP detachment, this particular person being one of them. Anyway, I know his name. I'm not going to say his name here, but I know who he is. And he is married. And he was availing himself of her services. Now, because she was now harassing me, and the OPP were harassing me, I'd never taken an interest in her business before. I didn't even know the woman lived in there. I didn't know who lived in there because I wasn't paying attention. But then I did, once you start screwing with me, then I will take an interest in your business. And I'm remarkably good at finding things out. If I decide I want to know something about you, I'll find out. I'm pretty good at it. And I can take a little scrap of information and I can find out a lot of stuff. I think that comes from the fact that people perceive me as being mentally weak and they perceive me to be stupid. And so a lot of the time they don't share information with me. And what's happened at times is there were situations even within my own family where I needed to know things and I wasn't told. It was kept from me because people thought that I wouldn't be able to handle it, or I'd be too stupid to handle it or to not understand it or whatever, so they just didn't tell me. And then I would do or say something I shouldn't have said or did because I didn't know the situation. And then they would use that against me. They'd say, well, see, this is why we don't tell that fool anything, because look how he acts. But if they'd told me, I wouldn't have acted that way, So, I'm operating at a disadvantage when I don't have the information everyone else has. So what I got very good at just gleaning scraps of information and then expounding on that and figuring it out. So what I figured out anyway was, and I figured this out through a variety of ways. I found out some things about this woman. I found out who she is. And then I knew, okay, this is the one that was the sister of this friend of mine whose father owned the record store, and so on like that. The little sister of this friend of mine or whatever from years and years back, from the mid-1980s. Anyway, I found out that she was, in fact, a prostitute. She was posing as a massage therapist, but she was, in fact, a prostitute. She was sexually servicing several members of the local OPP detachment. In fact, the cop who I saw leaving, or the cop who was harassing me, I saw him one day leaving her place, just in his regular street clothes, and he had parked his car quite a piece away. He had parked his car in back of another place nearby, and I actually saw that guy, going and getting his car. And so that's what it was anyway. He was one of her clients. He was looking pretty shifty when he came out of there. She didn't have a driver's license. She had allowed it to lapse, apparently. I found that out through somebody who knew her. And actually, I found that out for somebody who knew her, and it was confirmed by somebody else who I know, who actually bought her vehicle. When she allowed her driver's license to lapse, she had sold her vehicle, and I knew the person who bought it. And so I found out some stuff that way. See, you know, like I say, I'm good at finding things out. Anyway, another thing I found out about her, and this is through another person who had been made aware of her because he was connected to a police officer, and the police officer was aware of the prostitution, and the police officer was also aware that some of his colleagues were availing themselves of her services, and the police officer was also aware of a thing that she was doing. Apparently, there were two women in Perth who were doing this. What they would do is they would befriend older men, older single men, and they'd start going around to their homes, and they'd start, helping them, doing chores around their house or whatever, cleaning for them, cooking for them, and so on. And then after they did that for a little while, there were two women in town who were doing this. And in fact, my friend had rented a room in his house to one of these women, and she tried to pull it on him. What they do then is they say then, either you pay me or I'm going to file a complaint against you and say that you raped me. And so either you bribe me or I'll turn around and say you raped me. Well, of course, older men tend to be very concerned about scandal, and they don't want that kind of stress and that kind of drama, and she'd make a point of going after an older guy who had some money. Anyway, then she'd blackmail him, basically, extort money from him, because she'd have him scared that he was going to be falsely charged with rape. And it'd be a case where no sex had taken place, but then how do you prove that? And how do you prove, even if sex were to take place, how do you prove it was consensual? The nature of sex is such that it's a private act. So it's very difficult. It's not something that you're generally doing in front of an audience. So how do you prove anything that's really a he said, she said thing in many cases? And so these old guys, I bet you a lot of them weren't even capable. A lot of them probably weren't even physically capable, because they were elderly. But she would have threatened to make the accusation. It would scare them, and they would pay her off. And this was something, there were two women in town doing this, and like I say, one of those two women, not the woman I was having trouble with, but another one, had rented a room from a friend of mine in his house, and then he evicted her because she brought a lot of drama into the house, and because she had a crazy boyfriend that was making threats, and because she wasn't paying her rent. And so he evicted her, and she said, if you put me out of here, I'm going to accuse you of raping me. So he thought, I'm going to beat her to the punch, and I'm going to call the OPP. Lucky for him, he got a friend of his, a guy he went to school with, that happened to have become an OPP. That's who he ended up talking to. And that guy gave him quite an earful. And the guy told him, he said, we know all about her, and we know all about another one. And he said, this was the person, the one I was having trouble with. And he said, this is something that they're doing. And he said that the one that I'm having trouble with, that I was having trouble with, was a prostitute. And he acknowledged that several members of the OPP were availing themselves of her services. And that was one of the reasons that they were having trouble to get her, because she was being protected by some members of the OPP. So there were some that wanted to lock her up, but then there were others who were protecting her. And that was complicating things. Anyway, crazy stuff. This woman, anyway, she was just continuously harassing me. Every time she saw me, she would harass me. She kicked the crap out of my van. I had an accident with my car in Ottawa. A guy sideswiped me and actually knocked me up onto the sidewalk. I was driving a big Mercury Grand Marquis at the time. I was driving a 1997 Mercury Grand Marquis, and the guy sideswiped me. The guy was driving one of those Hyundai Tucson type things, a little Hyundai SUV. and he knocked me up onto the sidewalk, all four wheels. Did an awful number on my car anyway, just destroyed the car. I was able to drive the car home, but it was in bad shape, I'll tell you. Anyway, it was a write-off. And so I ended up, I bought a 1990 GMC rally van is what I bought. And that was a really handy thing for the kind of work I do. It was really handy. Anyway, this woman had come out of her place when my van was parked there, and she'd put the boots to it. I actually heard her in my apartment a block away, upstairs a block away, and across the main street. I heard her shrieking. And so I ran down there to see what was going on. And she was down there. I saw her down there kicking the crap out of my van. But by the time I got down there, she had ran back into her house. But she had laid into the passenger side of my van with her feet anyway. Anyway, one day, I'm crossing the street to go to my van, which I had parked on the other side of the side street that runs beside the bank. The main street intersects that side street. That street's called Harriet Street. That's the street she was living on. And it was the street that went right past my building after you crossed the main street. And anyway, I see a car come up to the corner, and it was an old Pontiac Sunbird. It was like an early 90s Pontiac Sunbird. Now, bear in mind, this is like 2015, 2016. Excuse me. Pardon me. This was an early 90s Pontiac Sunbird. Anyway, and the thing was in beautiful shape, and you never see those around here in beautiful shape. You hardly see them at all anymore. Even back 10 years ago, you very rarely saw them. You know, an early 90s Pontiac Sunbird, they were a disposable car. They lasted maybe 8 or 10 years, and they were done. And they rusted out real bad and stuff. And so generally, if it was like a 91 Pontiac Sunbird or a 90 Pontiac Sunbird or a 92 or whatever, by the year 2000, it was off the road, or it was on its way to being off the road. So, anyway, this thing it looked just like Nuvo. And I remember thinking some old guy must own that because, you know, it looks like it's been really well taken care of, and it would have to be to still be around. And then what do I see? I see her behind the wheel. Anyway, I just turned my head. I looked at the car, and I saw her behind the wheel. Well, she was signaling that she was going to turn left. But what did she do? She come straight through as I'm crossing the street. She accelerated hard, and she actually crossed lanes and came right at me. And I jumped back onto the sidewalk, and she just narrowly missed hitting me. Well, turns out that car belonged to it did belong to an old man anyway. I found that out later too, that she was driving this car. It belonged to some old man she had befriended, somebody she was lining up to run the blackmail scheme on. Anyway, another thing they used to do is, though, the OPP used to lend her the unmarked detective car. It was a black Chev Impala, and they used to lend that to her. And she had no driver's license. Plus, she was a civilian. She shouldn't have been in that car. Shouldn't have been driving that car anyway, because she was a civilian. But and she had no driver's license. Now, I don't know what would have happened if she had gotten into an accident, if she had caused an accident. But she had no driver's license anyway, and she was driving that car without authorization. Except, well, she had authorization, I guess. They were letting her take it. But, I mean, there was no legal authorization. It was illegal to let her take it. So the OPP were doing wrong by letting her take it. Anyway, that's just one example of something that happened to me anyway. This went on for quite a while, this harassment on her part. And finally, like I say, I just left town. It wasn't just her. It was a bunch of other things too. But yeah, there was one day there was a payphone down across the street from my building there, you know, and I'm up in my apartment with the windows closed, and I heard her down there on the payphone, and she was loud. and she's talking to some guy on the payphone, and she's saying about how she wanted him to pick her up on the down at Beckwith Street, not on Gore Street, but on Beckwith Street, which was a couple of blocks down on the side along Harriet Street and Beckwith Street. There was a couple of blocks down, from Gore Street, because she said she wanted to be discreet. And she told him, she said, and don't forget to bring toilet paper because there's going to be a big mess in your van when we're done, and all this business. And then she hung up, and a guy come along who was going to use the payphone because he had some business with Ontario Hydro. He said he had a problem with his bill. He seemed to know her. And they're talking, and she was telling him about how this man was going to pay her for sex, and that the agency had put her in touch with him because he was looking for a lady in her 40s. And like this, So anyway, yeah. Then one day I saw her on the street, and she was physically attacking a guy. She was actually chasing him down the street, beating him over the head, and shrieking at him because apparently he had made an appointment with her, and then he hadn't showed up. He'd stood her up, and she was telling him that he owed her money because he'd made the appointment. Whether he got the service or not, it didn't matter. He still had to pay her. And so she was chasing him down the street, beating on him anyway. She was afraid of me. I could tell because she'd go to the other side of the street and start screaming at me from the other side of the street. But see, in Perth, I had a bad reputation. I was known to be a violent man. And so a lot of people were frightened of me. I remember one day I got out of my car. It was actually at night. It was after dark, but I parked my car there beside my building, and I got out of it. I was driving an 85 Chev Caprice at the time. And there's this young guy walking down the street with another young guy, and he pointed at me. He said, "You see that guy right there?" He said, "Whatever you do," he said, "never F with that guy." That's what he said. So, I mean, people were scared of me anyway, I guess. And I kind of made it that they were because I was getting jumped on the street and everything prior to that. And so, yeah, what happened, though, is once people got scared of me, what they did is instead of confronting me directly and attacking me physically on the street, they'd spread dirty rumors about me, and they'd vandalize my car and stuff like that. I had to deal with all that then instead because they were afraid to try tackling me head on. What I started doing is I started carrying weapons. And I had a few incidents where I actually used those weapons. So I've had a few where I pulled them out and threatened guys with them, and in other cases I actually used them, at least in a limited way, and did the other guy some injuries. And once I had a few incidents like that, word got around, this guy's dangerous and he's crazy and he's not above killing you. You may think you're going to have fun beating him up, but he'll end up killing you. Plus, I would hold a grudge. And even after I had the confrontation, there were times that I would harass the other guy then. So, if I saw him on the street, I'd make a point of going after him and stuff like that, I remember one time this guy that I had a run-in with, he was walking down the opposite side of the street from me, and he started roaring at me anyway, cussing me out and stuff. I pulled a screwdriver I had in my pocket out, a sharpened screwdriver, and I said, "Come on over here and say that, and I'll stab you." No effing stab you to death, I said. And he just shut up and kept walking. But that's how I had to be because I was getting the crap kicked out of me constantly. People perceived me as weak and stupid, and they were coming at me in a big way. So I did what I had to do, and but I did get a reputation, and people were fearful of me. And I think that's the only reason that woman never physically attacked me, because she wasn't above going after a man and physically attacking him. Anyway, she did try to run me over with a car while she was driving without a license, driving somebody else's car, some poor old bastard who she was lining up to be blackmailed. And Yeah, that's just one story anyway. I've got a bunch of them, but that's just one of them. Anyway, yep, fun times. We'll talk to y'all later.